Good evening, everybody. My name's Terry O'Keefe. I will be chairing Committee of the Whole this evening, so I'll call this regular Committee of the Whole meeting on Monday, June 20th to order. Just for clarity, I would normally be chairing. We're in the center chair there, but I'm chairing from here today because we have a special council meeting directly after Committee of the Whole, and there's only one item on this Committee of the Whole agenda. So for ease of transition, I'll sit here, and then after this meeting is adjourned, Mayor McNeil Smith will take over the special council meeting. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. My colleagues who are here in chambers, and Councillor or Member Barbara Fallett, who is joining us from Zoom land. Hi, Barbara. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are in the lands of the Saanich people, and we're grateful for their stewardship of these lands for millennia, and we're grateful for the opportunity to share these lands with them today. I'd also like to acknowledge that tomorrow is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's an opportunity for all of us to learn more about and celebrate the rich history, resilience, and diversity of Indigenous peoples in our community. And so I invite colleagues and staff in the community to take a moment sometime tomorrow, if you have time, to learn more about our local Indigenous people. And one way you could do that is you could go to the website for our Saanich Leadership Council or their Facebook site. And some of the things you can find there, you can read about territorial acknowledgements. So if you're still wondering why we do those and the importance of them, you can learn about that. You can read the legend of the Saanich people or the emerging people and how they received their name. You can learn more about our local history here on the Saanich Peninsula. Also, you can read about some of the initiatives they're working on. So, for example, they're currently working on a clam garden restoration project with the Gulf Islands National Park Reserve, Royal Roads University, and Simon Fraser University. And you could also sign up for their newsletter to get a better understanding of what's going on in their community. Moving on to the approval of the agenda. I'll look to see if, for a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Motion carried. Next, we would have public participation period. Now, this is public participation in Committee of the Whole is only for things that are on the agenda for Committee of the Whole. So if you would like, if there's anyone in the audience who would like to speak to the one agenda item on this Committee of the Whole agenda, which is the Climate Action Plan, I'd ask you to come forward now. All right, I guess we'll move on then. Next is approval of the minutes for the last regular Committee of the Whole meeting.
Move adoption.
Second. All in favor? Thank you. Motion carried. And next we will move on to staff reports, which is the 2022 Climate Action Plan update. And our staff have a presentation to introduce that. Thank you.
Nope, now it's not. There we go. Alrighty, hello again.
For those of you who don't know me, I am Kira Gilmar, the Climate Action Coordinator for the town of Sydney. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll provide a brief update on the finalization, hopefully, of the Climate Action Plan and some next steps. Next slide. Maybe. Maybe not. Yeah. There we go. We should just scroll. One of these always has to happen. Let's see these days. Great. Alrighty. Back to the action. So last time I was here, I presented on the Climate Action Plan. We had just completed the develop draft plan stage. Since then, we've completed the second engagement phase and the review and refine phase, bringing us to where we are today, send to council. And I'll go into further detail about these phases through this presentation. Next slide. So as a brief recap, the plan is comprised of two parts. Part one, where we are today, is the existing conditions analysis. This introduces climate change and climate action, provides an overview of climate risks, presents the corporate and community GHG inventories, and sets emissions reductions targets in line with the OCP. And then part two is kind of where we're going from here. And this has 51 actions over 8 focus areas, including town leadership, transportation mobility, buildings, and natural environment. This part of the plan is meant to be kind of a high-level implementation plan in and of itself, including information about which department will lead each action, its current status, the timeline and kind of estimated potential cost, and kind of a preliminary priority designation just to kind of get us started. Thanks. So now to go into engagement phase 2, where we left off from last time. The intent of this phase of engagement was to raise awareness for the draft plan, highlighting proposed actions specifically, to build understanding of climate change and climate action, and encourage public review and feedback for the plan. Some of the key activities were the 2 open houses we had in April, one at Talista Park on a Saturday morning, and one at Beacon Ave on a Friday afternoon, coinciding with Earth Day. And to ensure that all the actions were as visibly accessible as possible, there was a large poster board with all the actions laid out by focus area, both for the town actions and the suggested community responses as well. It also went through APC review on April 19th, and there was an open public comment period through May 25th. And then after that, it was kind of going into the review and refine phase. The plan was promoted using online advertisement, including social media and the town website. There were Peninsula News Review ads for both of the open houses, and there are posters throughout the community. And then there's also a hard copy available for people to review at the front of Town Hall and at the library, so that maybe you could catch people who we wouldn't normally catch. Next slide. So, the feedback and revisions were based on the takeaways from the last council meeting, APC review, the open house comments, written public comments, and another round of interdepartmental staff review from across the organization. Key changes to the plan resulting from that feedback included a section addressing whether we met the targets in 2010 from that 2010 plan, reorganizing the actions in the tables in order by timeline and priority to kind of give a bit more structure to that. Addition of 6 new actions that came from feedback, updating details about some of the actions, so changing some of the timelines for them, And then additional information about next steps following endorsement of the plan in the implementation section, which I'll go to in the next slide. And then there's also some general revisions for grammar and clarity as well. So for implementation and reporting, once the plan is endorsed, staff will move into the next phase of the climate action plan implementation. So implementation planning will take place internally through interdepartmental staff workshops, trying to incorporate as many staff as possible to build capacity and understanding and buy-in. In order to prioritize actions in the climate action plan according to capacity and various knowledge about what's best to go, and to start incorporating these into future work plans and budget proposals. One of the goals of this process is to make sure staff have kind of a shared understanding about what the implementation of this plan will mean in practice. And then this process of implementation planning will also tie in reporting. So specific details about the most useful information to report on would be developed kind of concurrently. And as noted in the staff report, this would help ensure that the reporting mechanism supports effective long-term implementation and can be carried out within existing staff capacity. One potential method to report would be through the annual reporting process, and that section could also be popped out into kind of a standalone report advertised on the website, so you kind of have it in both places. Next slide. And then some additional next steps to touch on. While there's still specifics to be worked out through the implementation planning process, there are a few next steps that I wanted to highlight. For example, some of the potential priority actions for the implementation process include those from the building and transportation focus areas, in order to prioritize kind of the areas where we have the greatest emissions, which I kind of touched on in the last presentation. So buildings, a couple of the actions in the staff report was the flood construction level bylaw, which is really important for long-term adaptation, and the implementation of step code in advance of the provincial timeline. We had the opportunity to align with the rest of the peninsula where feasible and appropriate, because they're a little bit further ahead than us right now. And then transportation as well. While most of the active transportation next steps will come through the active transportation plan process, which is why it's not super detailed in this plan specifically. There are opportunities to investigate and implement some bike parking options. This is a relatively simple barrier that can be tackled in the nearer term. And then in terms of budget requests for specific actions, these will be brought to council as needed when those actions are brought forward for implementation. Where actions do not fit into existing operating budgets, funding from the Climate Action Reserve and the new local government climate action program can be leveraged. I don't know if you've heard about that, but the province will be giving us $118,000 for climate action projects, so very exciting news. And then staff will also pursue external grant funding as available and where capacity allows. And then last but not least, it's important to note that there will be further targeted engagement as needed depending on the action as those are advanced, such as the zoning bylaw update would obviously have its own engagement as we're going through and bringing in climate action considerations. Yeah, last slide. Yep. This is of course a very brief overview, but and there's more detail in the staff report and the plan, but I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can.
Thank you very much for that. I'll turn it to committee for questions. Yes. Member McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for all the work that's gone into the report or the plan, and having worked across departments to put this together. Two kind of high-level questions. One is you did make reference to timing of an annual report, and I'm just wondering if consideration has been given that the timing of the annual report might actually be in the fall, such that a council would have it in advance of strategic planning, their annual strategic planning process. That's kind of one part to it. The other is a number of the initiatives, a number of the recommendations indicate that they're currently underway or have been underway, is do you feel that an annual report as early as this fall might be possible, given that some initiatives have been underway over the past year?
Happy to look into that if that's something that council would like. I mean, at this time, I don't wanna give like a yes or no for sure, but I imagine that that would be something that we could look into.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't looking at making a motion this evening.
Okay.
I was just wondering if consideration had been given to those. The second question is, you did make reference to the, and we're of course pleased to see that while the provincial government had wound up its previous funding program, and there was some concern from municipalities across the province that they did introduce just this past May a new local government climate action program, and Sydney will be receiving $118,000 from that in 2022. A question through to staff and maybe to Mr. Hissick is, we were proactive in terms of staff brought forward in the budget that we passed earlier this year, our Climate Action Reserve Fund, and we have allocated money to that in 2022. Would these monies coming from the province on an annual basis go directly to that reserve fund, or does staff have a different accounting in mind?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure it has to go into that reserve. It's not town funding per se. I could see this being kept aside from the reserve funding and keep that for our own contributions. But I haven't really given it as much thought as perhaps I should have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Other members with questions? Mr. Humble?
Yeah, thank you. Just a point of clarification. The mayor had raised the annual reporting. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kira, but I think you were referring to the annual report, which has a statutory deadline of, is it July, sometime in June? June 30th. And so that's the intent, is to have that incorporated into the annual report for June 30th. So not an annual report of the Climate Action Plan, but embedded in our annual report, which has a deadline of June 30th. I believe that's the intent anyways.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from committee for staff? All right, I think we're good. Thank you for the report. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Thank you. It's not actually a question. I wanted to start talking about the report because we've got a recommendation in the report that we should endorse this. And I guess as I was spending a lot of time looking at this over the weekend, it didn't really strike me as a plan. And let me back up and say, I see merit in everything in the document. I see a lot of actions that make sense. But what I expect to see in a plan is it's going to identify the actions that are the highest priority, the ones we should be doing first. And if there are budget implications, it should be giving me some idea of what those budget implications are. I mean, that's kind of what I expect in a plan. And when I look at the actions, they are dominated by high and medium-high priority actions. There are actually only 7 that are low or low-medium. And everything is saying it's already either underway, ongoing, or planned, or budgeted for. So I'm sort of, it seems like this stuff's all already underway, and it doesn't look like we've got anything kind of in the offing or in this plan that we hadn't already identified. I guess I'm just finding it that a little bit of a challenge. But when I read your staff report, it seems like the implementation planning exercise is going to produce what I would be expecting to see in the report, in the plan. And I guess I'm just a bit concerned that if somebody looks at this plan now, it's very hard to pick out what the priorities should be. And, you know, you have mentioned some things like buildings and transportations are two big areas that are producing GHG where we should be probably focusing our attention. But that doesn't seem to come out balanced through this. Like everything, like the highs are scattered throughout all the different activity areas. The buildings and the transportation doesn't really kind of stand out in the table at all. I'm wondering if you shouldn't maybe have some very highs so that some of the highs kind of rise to the top. Anyway, I don't know if my colleagues are sharing some of this thinking, but I would like to actually see the implementation planning get done and then this draft get updated and turned into a final version after that.
Member McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for those comments. I guess one of the things I was reflecting on in a similar fashion was reference to as in the report, but also in your in the presentation about an implementation plan, and what time horizon would you see the implementation plan covering?
Can I respond to both of them? Okay. Just in terms of like whether this is a plan, I would say that, you know, this climate action plan is very much in line with kind of the broad best practices in local government climate action plans, and this is kind of what is being produced right now. In fact, this is more detailed than most of the other plans that are being produced, but and also for clarity, where they say planned in the status, that just means that they're things that we want to do. They're not something that's already in the works. So kind of the way that I'd phrase it, if it's budgeted, if it's something that had already been in the works beforehand, just to provide like continued rationale or support for it. And then I figured there wasn't a point to putting an action in the plan if we weren't going to plan to do it. So there, many of them are new actions, even if they might seem like they're not new. And then, sorry, can you repeat your question?
I was thinking of timing for what time horizon would an implementation plan cover?
I think I was envisioning kind of over the rest of the summer, potentially. I think the challenge is a lot of these actions require a lot of interdepartmental, kind of on-the-ground investigation to figure out kind of what all the nitty-gritty details are going to be. And so we figured it's good to kind of have that process once there's broad support for what's in the document before putting, you know, that into it. I don't know if I explained that very well, but
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to appreciate what the implementation plan,
essentially what
because we go into an sorry for interrupting, but we go
Yeah.
into an annual budgeting process, and many initiatives are going to be tied to staff resource or budgeting process. This document, we might imagine, has a 5 to 8 year time horizon as a larger plan, but the implementation plan isn't going to cover the 5 to 8 years.
I think the implementation plan is largely for kind of the nearer term, for which ones are going to fit, in the next few years, and some of the shorter, higher priority actions. But some of these actions are going to require kind of digging into them more than we had the capacity to do through this climate action planning process. So that's why it's been left at the higher level at this point.
And sorry, a question through to staff is, would an implementation plan come back to council? Or does staff see it just as a process?
I mean, I would certainly see an implementation plan, council at least being aware of it, and potentially even, maybe being involved even in the process. I mean, one thought comes to mind, if, as Kira's articulated, if it's sort of, we're focusing on, the near-term sort of items for the next 3 years. In my mind, it kind of aligns with our strategic planning process, and is some of that implementation planning work, happen through strategic planning, as an example. especially if we're looking at developing priorities for the next 3 years, because indeed that's the focus of our strategic planning, seems to be that 1 to 3 year horizons. So, you know, that's, and therefore council's definitely involved in that process, and you know, would be able to provide a perspective on what may be deemed those near-term priorities.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I don't know if I shared the same observation that Councillor Wainwright's brought forward, and I understand, you know, now that you've raised it, that perspective. I think I looked at this as providing us with that template, and really, I think as a tool to hold staff, to hold council accountable for identifying which priorities we can address as opportunity is presented, and to as well strategically work towards some of the projects and goals that are identified in the plan. So I was quite comfortable with the prospect of recognizing that we'd have to be fairly fluid. For example, as grant opportunities present themselves to pursue specific projects and undertakings, that we would look to readdress this. And I think the suggestion to align it to the strategic planning cycle made sense, that this is a tool that we would use with insight from staff to identify which projects are feasible to deliver upon, and to challenge ourselves to do so. So I get your point and your observation. I didn't come in with that perspective, and I think I remain comfortable with what's been identified in here, knowing that it will then be incumbent on staff and council to address this annually through the strategic planning process. So I'll leave my comments there, Chair.
I'll chime in then if there's no other speakers at this time while you continue to percolate over there. I do share some of Member Wainwright's comments, and to me, I feel like there's another piece that we need to, so that when we go to strategic planning, that we have some more input from staff in terms of where do you think we need to go? Like, to, you know, there was talk about, in some cases, there's maybe lack of capacity or lack of resources, that sort of thing needed. So it would be good to know that in a perfect world, here's what we think we should be doing. Here's the things that we need to do. Maybe we don't know exactly what the cost would be, but it could be maybe high, medium, low, and then in terms of priorities, high, medium, low in terms of where we think we would get the most bang for our buck of these things. I acknowledge, you know, comments about, you know, wanting to be flexible and seeing where the grants come up. And I appreciate that. However, I don't know that I'm too comfortable with just leaving it so fluid that we're going to be guided with our plan depending on where the money is all the time. Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Humble.
Yeah, I mean, I see, like past strategic planning processes where staff would, in advance of the strategic planning process, review those plans, whether it's the climate action plan, whether it's the Parks Master Plan, whatever plan we have, and look at those in the context of what's feasible, perhaps over the next 2 or 3 years, and bring that forward as discussion points for council's consideration. So I don't think it would be done sort of willy-nilly. I think it would be done by staff looking at it in advance and bringing that forward for council's consideration as part of the strategic planning process. So I don't think it would be done ad hoc. I think it would be done through the lens of staff first, bringing it forward to council for their consideration as part of that process.
Right, yeah. And I think that's kind of what I would envision as well. I would hope that we would get something from staff prior to our upcoming strategic planning, sort of outlining what you've discussed as well. And I just also wanted to comment on the reporting mechanism. So having information in the annual report is good. However, I think it would be something, I was looking for something a bit more robust, whether that's on a quarterly basis or whether that's something that gets incorporated into the different departments in engineering and planning in terms of what are some of the goals or targets that we're setting for ourselves, and having some sort of reporting out on that. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it would be good to have more frequent, maybe even twice a year, reporting out on that. I'll leave it at that for now. Member Wainwright?
Thank you, Chair. I can see this fitting into our strategic priorities process, and obviously, we are going to want to take advantage of grant opportunities, so there will need to be some flexibility, and I appreciate that. But when you've got a long-term thing like coast adaptation to sea level rise, which isn't like a 3-4 year project, it doesn't kind of fit the strategic planning as a single activity. You've either got to break it up into a series of phases, like identify options, evaluate the options, whatever, and I don't know what the long-term thing looks like. I'm just appreciating that when you've got a 20-year project, it doesn't fit neatly into your 3-year strategic plan. So I am seeing a bit of a gap here, and it's actually on some of the high priority, long-term, very expensive that I'm seeing the gap. So that's making me a little uncomfortable.
I guess I can just ask you a question, can I? Question to staff. In terms of that longer term planning, so we have, is it a 20-year infrastructure plan that we do? And so I'm just wondering whether there's any elements of this that might sort of be incorporated into that longer term sort of planning that Member Wainwright commented on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This will be a multifaceted approach to planning. It'll involve strategic planning, the financial plan, and as you say, the long-term infrastructure. It's not going to be some easy deliverable this fall. It's going to be over time. This new grant program, which we received details on about 3 weeks ago, essentially triples our immediately available funding. So that's going to add to our capacity in terms of how much we can bring forward at the first iteration. But it will be multifaceted over a number of years as we slowly flesh this plan out once it's approved in, I don't want to say in principle, but the principles outlined in this plan are approved, and then we can get going on fleshing it out.
Okay, thank you. Member Garnett? Oh,
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, colleagues, for your comments. Thank you, Ms. Gilmore, for your presentation and for the plan and your hard work that you put into it. Appreciate that. I came in with the same sort of mindset as Councillor Rintoul, seeing it as a template. I'm appreciative of the fact that some of the things that were asked for you've included in the document now, like how are we doing, where were we, and how are we now. That was important for me. So I understand where Councillor Wainwright's coming from, but I'm also understanding where staff is saying that it's kind of, I don't know if we can get that specific right now, and I think it's important that you have in here that you're working with all the different departments, and they're going to work across each other and with council and with the various entities, and I think it'll all work itself out. So I'm not too concerned from that respect, but I think the word template is a good word that Councillor Rintoul used, and that's kind of the way I'm viewing it. So thank you, Chair.
any other comments from committee? No other comments? Is there a recommendation? Member Rintoul?
Thank you. I'll move that committee endorse the climate action plan.
Second. Any discussion? Member Wainwright?
Yeah, I guess through you to staff, what does endorse mean? Is that like adopt? Is it like receive? Or is it somewhere in between those?
I don't think it's adopt. And, you know, I take your point. I think it's supporting in principle. And if it is the intent of staff to be more clear around approve, then maybe we should suggest that. But
Sorry, that might be my bad. My understanding was adopting was only for bylaws, but since this wasn't a bylaw, we couldn't adopt it. So maybe that's just a wording.
I would just say approve the plan.
If the chair will accept a friendly amendment there, we'll move the committee approve the climate action plan. So replacing endorse, approve.
Second? Any other further comment or discussion on that? Okay, all in favor? Opposed? One opposed, Member Wainwright.
Sorry, Chair, your mic wasn't on. I didn't hear.
Sorry, Member Fallett. We were voting on the recommendation that council approve the climate action plan. Were you in favor?
Thank you, yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, committee. That concludes our business for committee of the whole. I'll call for motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? All right, thank you.